Mail-order bride rejected for being big-nosed until another man showed her true love. The morning air bit at Natalia's cheeks as she stepped off the plane in Chicago. April in America was colder than she'd expected. She clutched her thin jacket closer, her fingers trembling. Whether from the chill or her nerves, she couldn't tell. Her entire life had been packed into one suitcase and a carry-on bag. Everything she owned hauled across oceans and continents to start anew. "I am here," she whispered to herself in her native Ukrainian, the words forming a small cloud in the air. "I am really here." She thought of her family's tearful goodbyes at the Lviv airport. Her mother had pressed a small Orthodox icon into her palm, Saint Nicholas, patron of travelers and those seeking marriage. "For protection," she'd whispered. Now Natalia touched the icon in her pocket, drawing strength from the connection to home. 6 months of correspondence with James had led to this moment. First through the international matchmaking service, then through private emails and video calls. He seemed kind, stable, with a good job in finance and a house in the suburbs. His emails were thoughtful, asking about her interests in art and history, sharing stories about his life in Chicago. The care packages he sent, American chocolates, a cashmere scarf, English language books, made her feel valued even across thousands of miles. At 32, Natalia had watched her chances for marriage in her small town dwindle. The war had pushed many to leave, and those who stayed offered little hope for the future she dreamed of. Her last relationship had ended 3 years ago when Petro moved to Poland for construction work, promising to send for her. The promises faded with time, like footprints washed away by rain. In her hometown, she'd been considered too educated by some men, too old by others. Her position at the small historical museum barely covered her expenses, and the building itself had suffered damage during recent shelling. The future there looked bleak and uncertain. James had promised her many things: security, comfort, a family. America, the land of opportunity. She knew that mail-order relationships carried stigma, but she preferred to think of it as an arranged marriage with modern technology. People had been finding spouses this way for centuries. Her own great-grandmother had been matched with her husband through family connections, having only met him once before the wedding. They had built a loving marriage that lasted 50 years. "It's practical," she had explained to her skeptical friend Olena before leaving. "We both want the same things. Romance can grow from respect and shared goals." As she navigated through the airport, Natalia's hand unconsciously rose to touch her nose, a gesture that had become a nervous habit since childhood. The prominent ridge had been inherited from her father's side of the family, a distinctive feature that marked the Kovalenko lineage. Her grandmother used to tell her that strong features meant character, that her prominent nose was a sign of intelligence and determination. "Look at the statues of our heroes," she would say. "None of them have small, forgettable faces." But the teasing throughout school had left its mark. The nickname Hawk following her through adolescence, the boys who asked her to dance with her friends but never with her, the well-meaning aunt who once suggested she save money for cosmetic surgery. Even now, she found herself avoiding her reflection in the airport's gleaming surfaces, angling her face when taking photos, always careful about how she presented herself to the world. James had seen her, of course, over video calls with soft lighting and careful angles. She had been honest, never trying to hide her appearance completely. He had seemed accepting, even complimentary once, saying her profile reminded him of a young Barbara Streisand. It wasn't exactly a comparison she understood, but she had looked up the American singer afterward and felt flattered. She spotted him before he saw her. James stood near the baggage claim, holding a small sign with her name. He was taller than she'd expected, his hair neatly parted, wearing a crisp button-down shirt that looked freshly ironed, clean-shaven with wire-rimmed glasses that gave him an intellectual air. In their video calls, he had seemed softer, more casual. This version of him looked polished, but somehow less approachable. Natalia took a deep breath, smoothed her travel-wrinkled blouse, and walked toward her future with as much confidence as she could muster. "James," she called, waving slightly. His eyes found her, traveled quickly from her face to her body and back, and in that moment she saw it. The flicker of disappointment that crossed his face before he could mask it. A slight widening of the eyes, a momentary tightening of his lips. It lasted only a second, but to Natalia it felt like a blade to her heart. She had seen that look before, had catalogued its variations throughout her life. He recovered quickly, smiling and stepping forward, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Natalia, welcome to Chicago." He leaned in for a brief, awkward hug that left Natalia feeling cold despite the physical contact. His cologne was expensive, overwhelming. Nothing like the subtle scent she'd imagined when reading his letters. "I am very happy to meet you," she said carefully, her accent thick, but her English clear. She had practiced these first sentences hundreds of times in front of her mirror at home, wanting to make a good impression. Now they felt hollow, like lines from a play where her co-star had gone off script. "Let's get your luggage and head home." "You must be exhausted. How was your flight?" His tone was polite, businesslike. Gone was the warmth from their video calls, the gentle teasing about her fear of flying, the excitement about finally meeting in person. "It was long, but not too bad. I watched 2 movies and slept a little." She spoke slowly, focusing on her pronunciation. Fear and disappointment made her English worse, the words feeling clumsy in her mouth. The ride to his house was filled with polite small talk about her flight, the weather, the suburbs they drove through. But Natalia felt the tension in the car, the way James rarely looked directly at her, how his initial enthusiasm seemed to have dimmed. He pointed out landmarks with the detached air of a tour guide rather than a fiancé sharing his world. She tried to revive their old connection. "You mentioned that spring is beautiful here. Will the flowers bloom soon?" "Probably in a few weeks," he replied, without the enthusiasm he'd shown when sending her photos of his garden in previous years. "The weather's been cooler than usual." By the time they reached his house, a modest but neat 2-story in a quiet neighborhood with identical houses lining the street, the sun had begun to set. The house was exactly as he had described in his emails and shown in photos. Beige siding, neatly trimmed hedges, a small covered porch. It looked comfortable, solid if somewhat impersonal. James showed her to the guest bedroom, a space decorated in neutral tones with a quilted bedspread and generic landscape prints on the walls. It held none of the personal touches she had imagined would be waiting for her. No flowers, no welcome note, no small gift to celebrate her arrival. "I thought you might want to rest and get settled," he said, lingering at the doorway as if afraid to enter the room. "There's a bathroom through there. Clean towels in the cabinet. I put together some essentials, toothpaste, soap, that kind of thing, in case you needed them." He gestured vaguely toward the bathroom. "We can talk more tomorrow when you're not so tired." "Thank you," Natalia said, fighting back the sinking feeling in her stomach. This wasn't how she had imagined their first meeting. In her dreams, there had been warmth, excitement, the beginning of love. Champagne to celebrate her arrival, perhaps. Questions about her family, her journey, interest. This felt like accommodation. "The Wi-Fi password is on the nightstand if you want to let your family know you arrived safely," he added before stepping back. "Good night, Natalia." "Good night, James." The door closed softly behind him, leaving her alone in the unfamiliar room. She unpacked slowly, arranging her few possessions in the guest room, wondering if they would ever make it to the master bedroom. The clothes she had carefully selected, the ones she thought would appeal to American tastes, looked shabby and foreign when hung in the pristine closet. Her small collection of jewelry, including her mother's amber necklace, seemed out of place on the modern dresser. When she finally allowed herself to look in the mirror, she saw what James had seen at the airport. Her prominent nose in profile, the feature that had defined so much of her life. The feature that had once caused a modeling scout to visit her high school, take one look at her face, and pass her over without a word. She had hoped that an ocean away it might matter less. That her intelligence, her kindness, her cooking skills and work ethic would outweigh what she lacked in conventional beauty. That night, she cried silently into her pillow, second-guessing every decision that had led her here. The weight of her choice pressed down on her, the money spent, the job resigned, the apartment surrendered. The fragile hope of a new beginning that now seemed to be crumbling before it had even taken shape. Over the next week, James maintained his polite demeanor, but the distance between them grew more apparent. He left early for work and returned late, citing a major project that required his attention. When they did speak, the conversations were superficial. The weather, Chicago landmarks she should visit someday, practical matters about the house. He showed her how to use the appliances as if she were a house guest or a child, not a woman he had planned to marry. He never touched her beyond that first awkward hug, never mentioned their future together as he had in their correspondence. The matching wedding bands he had once sent photos of, simple gold with engraved patterns, were nowhere to be seen. When she cooked Ukrainian dishes, hoping to impress him with the culinary skills she had mentioned in her letters, he ate quickly and complimented her politely, but without enthusiasm. In the evenings, he retreated to his home office, leaving her to watch American television shows she barely understood, or to video chat with her increasingly concerned family. "He is just busy," she told her mother, forcing a smile. "We are still getting to know each other." Each night she returned to the guest bedroom, the door between them a physical manifestation of the emotional wall that was growing higher by the day. On the 8th day, as they sat across from each other at dinner, picking at a takeout meal from an Italian restaurant, their first dinner out cancelled due to James's work commitments, Natalia finally gathered her courage. "James," she began, setting down her fork. Her heart pounded so hard she was sure he could hear it. "I feel there is problem between us. You are different from our talks before." She had rehearsed these lines when he was at work, wanting to be clear despite her language limitations. James stared at his plate for a long moment before meeting her eyes. She noticed then how attractive he was in a conventional way. Symmetrical features, clear skin, straight white teeth. Everything she was not, everything that was valued in both American and Ukrainian culture. "I'm sorry, Natalia. I've been trying to figure out how to say this." He sighed heavily, pushing his plate away. "You're a lovely person, really, smart, kind. Your English is much better than I expected. But I don't feel the connection I thought we would have." "Is it my English? I am practicing." No, your English is fine." He hesitated, running a hand through his neatly trimmed hair. "It's just that you look different than I expected." The word hung between them, and Natalia felt heat rising to her cheeks. Shame, familiar and bitter, flooded through her. Different how? James looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting around the room, landing anywhere but on her face. "Just different. The camera angles on our calls, they didn't show everything clearly." Her hand rose to her nose before she could stop it. That unconscious gesture of insecurity she had battled her entire life. James's eyes followed the movement, confirming what she already knew. What she had feared since seeing that flicker of disappointment at the airport. "I see," she said quietly. The food in front of her might as well have been cardboard for all she could taste it now. "I'm really sorry. I feel terrible about this. I know you came all this way." He looked genuinely distressed, which somehow made it worse. Pity was more painful than cruelty. "I'll help you with whatever you need, if you want to go back home or find somewhere else to stay. I can cover your expenses until you figure things out." Natalia sat perfectly still, dignity the only thing keeping her from crumbling. The dream of a new life, the house with a garden, the children with dual citizenship, the security and respect she had hoped for, dissolved before her eyes. In its place was the humiliating reality. She had been found wanting. Again. "I will think about what I want to do," she managed to say, her voice steadier than she felt. "Thank you for being honest." That night, lying in the guest bed that would never be replaced by a shared one, Natalia stared at the ceiling. The crushing weight of her situation pressed down on her chest, making it difficult to breathe. She had spent nearly all her savings on this journey. The application fees for the matchmaking service, the visa costs, the new clothes, the plane ticket. Going back to Ukraine meant returning as a failure, facing pity from friends and relatives who had attended her going-away party with such hopeful faces. But staying in America without James's sponsorship would be nearly impossible. Her tourist visa would expire in 6 months. She had no work permit, no family ties, no support network. Everything she had planned hinged on a marriage that would now never happen. She thought of her small apartment back home, now rented to a young couple. Her museum job already filled by someone else. The life she had left behind, imperfect but familiar, now gone. In the morning, when James had left for work with another awkward, apologetic goodbye, she allowed herself to cry freely. The tears came in waves, hot and relentless, until her eyes were swollen and her throat raw. She cried for her shattered dreams, for the humiliation of rejection, for the uncertain future that stretched before her. Then she washed her face, applied concealer to her reddened eyes, put on her best outfit, a navy blue dress with a subtle pattern that her friend Olena had insisted made her look like a real American, and walked to the small coffee shop she had noticed a few blocks away. She needed to be among people, to think clearly about her options. Perhaps she could look for work there, start saving for a ticket home. The coffee shop, Brewer's Corner, according to the hand-painted sign, was warm and inviting, with worn wooden tables and the rich aroma of freshly ground beans. It reminded her of the small cafe near her museum, where she used to grade papers from her occasional English tutoring jobs. She ordered a black coffee in careful English and took a seat by the window, watching Americans go about their morning routines. Young mothers with strollers, business people tapping on laptops, students with backpacks slung over one shoulder. Everyone seemed to have a purpose, a direction. Her future had never felt more uncertain. Michael Donovan had been coming to Brewer's Corner every morning for the past 3 years. At 40, he had settled into comfortable routines. Coffee at 7:45, work at his architectural firm by 8:30, evenings spent with his dog Winston, an aging golden retriever with a greying muzzle, or working on renovation projects in the 1920s bungalow he had bought after his divorce. The predictability provided comfort after the chaos of his marriage's end. His ex-wife Lauren had been a whirlwind of excitement and unpredictability, qualities that had attracted him initially but eventually wore him down. The constant social obligations, the impulsive decisions, the emotional highs and lows had left him exhausted. After his divorce 5 years ago, he had found peace in solitude and structure. He knew most of the regulars at Brewer's Corner, by sight if not by name, the elderly man who read physical newspapers, the college student who always wore headphones, the pair of nurses who came in after night shifts. The woman by the window was new, and something about her made him pause as he waited for his order. She sat with straight posture, contrasting with the sadness in her eyes, her fingers wrapped around the coffee cup, as if seeking its warmth. She was striking, with dark hair pulled back from high cheekbones and a distinctive profile that reminded him of classical sculptures he had studied during his architectural training in Rome. She seemed both present and elsewhere, observing the world around her with tired eyes that suggested recent tears. He hesitated for a moment, then approached her table. It was unlike him. He generally kept to himself, but something in her solitary vigil resonated with a familiar loneliness. "Excuse me," he said, "I don't mean to intrude, but is this seat taken? The place is unusually crowded today." It wasn't really, but it seemed a less intrusive opening than asking directly if she was okay. Natalia looked up, momentarily startled. The man standing before her was tall with kind eyes behind tortoise-shell glasses and slight creases around them, suggesting he smiled often. His hair was starting to grey at the temples, and he wore the casual confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin. Unlike James, whose polished appearance always seemed like armor, this man had a lived-in quality that put her more at ease. "No, please," she gestured to the empty chair, her accent evident in just those 2 words. "Thank you." He sat down and extended his hand. "I'm Michael." "Natalia," she replied, shaking his hand briefly. His palm was warm and calloused, the hands of someone who worked with more than just computer keyboards. "That's a beautiful name." "Russian." "Ukrainian," she corrected gently. She had grown used to this mistake from Americans, who often conflated all Slavic countries. "I apologize for my ignorance," he said with a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Are you visiting Chicago?" Natalia hesitated, unsure how to answer. The truth was complicated, embarrassing, but something about his direct gaze made her reluctant to lie. "I arrived last week, but my plans have changed." The words felt inadequate to describe the collapse of her future, but they were all she could manage without her voice breaking. Something in her tone made Michael look at her more carefully. I'm sorry to hear that. Chicago can be overwhelming at first, but it has its charms once you get to know it. Perhaps, she said noncommittally, taking a sip of her coffee. It was stronger than what she was used to, but the bitterness matched her mood. Michael sensed her reluctance and changed the subject. What part of Ukraine are you from? For the next 20 minutes, Natalia found herself telling this stranger about her hometown near Lviv, about the architecture that had survived wars and occupations. The Baroque churches with their distinctive domes, the Austrian-influenced administrative buildings, the Soviet-era apartment blocks being reclaimed with colorful murals. Michael listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions about historical influences on Ukrainian design. When she mentioned her former job as an administrative assistant at a small museum, his interest seemed genuine. That sounds fascinating, he said, leaning forward slightly. I spent a semester studying architectural preservation in Eastern Europe, but we focused mostly on Prague and Budapest. I'd love to see Lviv someday. It is beautiful, she said, a hint of pride warming her voice. Even with all our troubles, tourists still come for the history, the coffee, the chocolate. For a moment, she forgot her current predicament, transported back to the city she had loved despite its challenges. I should go, Michael said eventually, checking his watch. But it was a pleasure meeting you, Natalia. Perhaps I'll see you here again. She nodded, surprised to realize she had almost forgotten her troubles during their conversation. Perhaps. Thank you for listening to my stories of home. Thank you for sharing them, he replied, and his smile seemed to linger with her long after he had gone. That evening, when James asked about her day during another stilted dinner, she found herself mentioning the coffee shop, but not Michael. That brief connection felt like something valuable and fragile, something separate from the failure that her engagement had become. The next morning, after another night of restless sleep and anxious planning, she returned to the coffee shop, half hoping and half doubting that Michael would be there. He was, sitting at a table with the newspaper and a steaming mug. He looked up as if sensing her presence and smiled, gesturing to the empty chair at his table. He joined her again, this time telling her about his work as an architect and his passion for restoring old buildings. His current project involved converting a former warehouse into loft apartments while preserving its industrial character. His enthusiasm was contagious, his hands moving expressively as he described the challenges of modern plumbing in historic structures. His passion reminded her of her museum colleagues who could speak for hours about restoration techniques for ancient textiles or the proper archival storage of documents. Do you have photographs of your projects? She asked, genuinely interested. He pulled out his phone, showing her before and after images of buildings he had helped transform. Neglected spaces reborn with respect for their original character. His firm specialized in adaptive reuse, finding new purposes for structures that had outlived their original functions. In a way, he said, it's like giving these buildings a second chance, letting them start a new chapter without erasing their history. The words resonated with her in ways he couldn't have intended. On the third day, he arrived with a book about Chicago architecture, dog-eared and clearly well-loved. I thought you might find this interesting, since you mentioned your museum work. It shows the evolution of the city's architectural styles over time. Thank you, she said, genuinely touched by the gesture. No one had given her a gift since she'd arrived in America. This is very kind. Would you like to see some of these buildings in person? I could show you around this weekend if you're free. No pressure, of course. There was a slight hesitation in his voice, a vulnerability that made her feel less alone in her uncertainty. Natalia hesitated. Her situation with James remained unresolved. He had given her time to consider her options, both of them living like polite strangers in his house. The practicalities of her situation weighed heavily. The limited funds, the visa constraints, the lack of a support network. But the thought of spending a day exploring the city with someone who actually seemed to enjoy her company was too tempting to resist. Yes, she decided, I would like that very much. Their tour of Chicago began at the Cultural Center, with its magnificent Tiffany dome that made Natalia gasp. The mosaic of colored glass created patterns of light that danced across the marble floor, reminding her of the stained glass windows in Lviv's ancient churches. But this was distinctly American, optimistic, grand in scale, celebrating civic pride rather than religious devotion. "The largest Tiffany dome in the world," Michael explained, watching her reaction with pleasure. "Built in 1897 as part of what was then the Chicago Public Library." As an architect, Michael knew the stories behind the buildings, the visions of their creators. He took her to hidden architectural gems off the tourist path, showing her the city through his eyes. The elegant simplicity of Mies van der Rohe's modernist buildings. The playful postmodernism of the Harold Washington Library with its massive owl sculptures. The imposing grandeur of the Board of Trade building where grain futures had been traded for generations. "Architecture is frozen music," he said, quoting Goethe as they stood looking up at a particularly graceful Art Deco skyscraper. "Every building is trying to tell us something about the time it was created and the people who built it." His passion for his subject was infectious. Natalia found herself asking questions, making connections to the architectural history she knew from Europe. For the first time since arriving in America, she felt intellectually engaged, her thoughts valued. Watching her take in the graceful lines of a Louis Sullivan building, Michael found himself captivated by her profile. The way her distinctive nose balanced her other features perfectly, giving her face character and strength that conventional prettiness often lacked. "You have the face of a Renaissance painting," he said suddenly. When she looked at him in surprise, he continued, "Sorry if that sounds strange. It's just that artists used to celebrate strong features. Modern beauty standards are so bland in comparison." Natalia felt herself blushing, unsure how to respond to what seemed like a genuine compliment about the very feature she'd been most self-conscious about all her life. No one had ever spoken about her appearance that way before, finding beauty in what others considered a flaw. "In my culture, small nose is considered more beautiful for women," she said carefully. "Well, then your culture and mine share the same unfortunate bias," he replied. "But art history disagrees. Look at Botticelli's women, or Vermeer's. They had presence, distinctiveness." He spoke without the forced enthusiasm of someone trying to make her feel better, but with the conviction of someone stating an obvious truth. As the day progressed, they stopped for lunch at a small Polish restaurant that reminded Natalia of home. Hearty soups, pierogi-like dumplings, the familiar tastes of Eastern Europe adapted to American ingredients. Over their meal, she found herself sharing more about her situation, how she had come to America for a marriage that now seemed unlikely to happen. She spoke tentatively at first, afraid of judgment, but Michael's expression remained open and engaged. She didn't mention the specific reason for James's rejection, but Michael was perceptive. "His loss," he said simply when she finished her story. "A man who can't see your worth at first glance doesn't deserve to discover it slowly." The statement, delivered without pity, without condescension, brought tears to her eyes that she quickly blinked away. "It is complicated. He has been decent about it, offering to help me." "Decency is the minimum," Michael replied, "not something to be particularly celebrated." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "What will you do now?" It was the question she had been asking herself every night, lying awake in James's guest room. "I am not sure. I have some time on my visa. Perhaps I will try to find work, save money before deciding." She didn't mention how difficult that would be without proper authorization, how limited her options were. They continued their architectural tour through the afternoon, walking along the river where the city's earliest settlements had grown into a metropolis. Michael showed her buildings in various states of transformation, some being restored, others repurposed, each with a story of decline and rebirth. By the end of their day together, walking along the lakeshore as the sun set behind the skyline, Natalia felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. The gold and pink light reflected on Lake Michigan's surface, creating a moment of beauty so intense it almost hurt. Michael was easy to talk to, interested in her thoughts, respectful of her situation without reducing her to an object of pity. "I've enjoyed today very much," she told him as they prepared to part ways near a train station. "Thank you for showing me your city." "So have I," he replied. "Would it be too forward to ask if we could do this again?" She smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "Not too forward at all." On the bus ride back to James's house, Natalia realized she needed to make a decision about her future. The connection she felt with Michael was unexpected but undeniable. Not just attraction, but a sense of being valued for who she was, rather than evaluated against some ideal. Yet she was still technically engaged to James, living in his house, dependent on his goodwill until she could establish herself. When she arrived, James was waiting in the living room, his laptop closed beside him, his expression serious. "We need to talk," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "I've been thinking about our situation, and I believe it's best if we officially end our engagement." The words were practiced, careful, the tone of a man delivering unpleasant business news. "I've booked you a hotel room downtown for the next 2 weeks, paid in advance, to give you time to figure out your next steps. I can also help with your return ticket to Ukraine, if that's what you want." Though she had expected this, the finality of it still stung. A small part of her had hoped that he might see beyond her appearance, might discover the woman he had seemed to connect with through their letters and calls, but his decision, like his initial reaction at the airport, hinged on the physical. "Thank you for your consideration," she said carefully, holding on to her dignity with both hands. "I will accept the hotel room. As for returning home, I need time to think." James nodded, seemingly relieved that she hadn't reacted emotionally. "I'll help you pack tomorrow. And Natalia—" He paused, looking genuinely contrite. "I am sorry for how this turned out. I should have been more thorough in our video calls." She looked at him directly, seeing not malice, but the limited vision of a man who had never had to look beyond the surface of things, who had never had to fight to be valued. "Yes," she said simply, "you should have." The next morning, she packed her few possessions once more, leaving behind the small gifts James had sent her during their correspondence. The cashmere scarf, the English novels, the silver bracelet with her initials. They belonged to a future that would never happen, to a woman she had tried to become but couldn't. James drove her to the hotel in downtown Chicago, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. The hotel was moderately priced but clean, a step above what she could have afforded on her own, but far from luxury. As they parted in the lobby, he handed her an envelope with cash, for expenses, and a brief, awkward hug. "Let me know what you decide about going back," he said. "I'll help with arrangements either way." "Thank you," she replied, accepting the envelope because pride wouldn't pay her bills. "Goodbye, James." The room was impersonal but clean, a blank slate upon which she could begin to imagine a different future than the one that had brought her to America. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the generic cityscape print on the wall, feeling both adrift and strangely liberated. She texted Michael, whom she had cautiously exchanged numbers with, explaining her changed circumstances. His response was immediate. "I'm sorry about the situation, but glad you have some time to consider your options. Would you like to have dinner tomorrow night?" Over the next 2 weeks, Natalia and Michael spent every evening together. He showed her more of Chicago, introducing her to his favorite restaurants, taking her to hear live music in small clubs where jazz musicians improvised like architectural geniuses working in sound instead of stone. He brought her to meet his friends, a diverse group of architects, designers, and preservationists who welcomed her warmly and asked genuine questions about her background and expertise. During the days, she researched her options: visitor visa extensions, potential work permits, language classes to improve her already solid English. She called the Ukrainian consulate, seeking advice about her situation. She explored Chicago on her own, finding a small Ukrainian community in the city where she could occasionally hear her native language and buy familiar foods. Gradually, she began to see a possible future for herself here, one very different from what she had planned, but perhaps more authentic. Michael was a significant part of that vision, not as a ticket to residency, but as someone with whom she felt a genuine connection. On her last night at the hotel, they sat together at a small Italian restaurant, the kind of place where the owner knew Michael by name and treated them like family. Over plates of homemade pasta and glasses of Chianti, they talked about architecture, art, and the strange paths that had led them both to this moment. "I've been thinking," Michael said, after they had lingered over dessert and coffee, "my firm has been looking for an administrative assistant. Someone organized who can help manage client files and coordinate with contractors. Your museum experience would be relevant, and the firm could sponsor your work visa. It wouldn't be charity. We genuinely need someone, and your multilingual skills would be an asset. Natalia looked at him skeptically. You would do this for someone you just met. The offer seemed too perfect, too convenient. She had experienced enough disappointment to be wary of easy solutions. I would help a friend who deserves a fair chance, he corrected. The job would be yours to succeed or fail based on your own merits, and it would give you time to decide what you really want, whether that's staying in Chicago, moving elsewhere in the States, or eventually returning to Ukraine. She considered his offer carefully, turning it over in her mind. And what about us? This friendship? Would working for your company complicate things? Michael smiled. I wouldn't be your direct supervisor, and as for us, I enjoy spending time with you, Natalia. I'd like to keep doing that to see where it leads naturally, without pressure or expectations. But that's separate from the job offer. His honesty reassured her. Unlike her arrangement with James, which had been transactional from the start, companionship and family in exchange for a new life in America, this felt like a genuine opportunity, a door opening rather than a contract. I would like to interview for this position, she said finally, properly, not as a favor. 2 days later, Natalia interviewed with Michael's firm and was offered the position based on her organizational skills and her experience managing the museum's archives. The salary was modest but fair, enough to support herself independently. The immigration attorney retained by the company helped her navigate the complex visa process, explaining each step with clarity and patience. She found a small studio apartment within her new salary range, in a diverse neighborhood with a mix of immigrants and young professionals. It was modest, but entirely her own. The first place she had lived alone, decorated with a few carefully chosen items that reflected her taste rather than her circumstances. A poster of Lviv's historic center, a small painting from a local Chicago artist she had discovered, books in both English and Ukrainian. In the months that followed, Natalia built a life in Chicago. Her colleagues respected her efficiency and attention to detail. She made friends, joined a Ukrainian cultural society, took evening classes in design history at a community college. With each day, her English improved, her confidence grew, and the shadow of rejection that had followed her from Ukraine began to fade. And throughout it all, her relationship with Michael deepened gradually and authentically. They visited museums together, attended architectural lectures, cooked meals. And throughout it all, her relationship with Michael deepened gradually and authentically. They visited museums together, attended architectural lectures, cooked meals in her tiny kitchen where Michael's height made him duck to avoid the low-hanging light fixture, a quirk that always made Natalia laugh. Unlike her correspondence with James, which had been carefully constructed to present ideal versions of themselves, her relationship with Michael unfolded naturally, with all the imperfections and genuine discoveries that came with truly knowing another person. He snored lightly when he slept. She became irritable when hungry. He was obsessively punctual. She left tea bags on countertops. These small truths were exchanged not as flaws to be tolerated, but as the unique contours that made them who they were. 6 months after her arrival in America, Natalia received a package from Ukraine. Her mother had sent family photographs, dried herbs from their garden, and a small hand-embroidered cloth with traditional Ukrainian patterns. Among the items was a letter written in her mother's elegant Cyrillic script. I worry about you, my daughter, her mother wrote, but I also sense a new strength in your voice when we speak. Perhaps America had different plans for you than the ones you carried in your suitcase. Sometimes life's greatest disappointments lead us to our truest paths. That evening, as she showed Michael the embroidery and translated her mother's words, tears filled her eyes. Not from sadness, but from recognition. The path that had seemed so clear when she boarded the plane to Chicago had vanished, replaced by one she was creating step by step, choice by choice. Your mother is wise, Michael said, his fingers gently tracing the intricate patterns of the embroidery. And talented. I see where you get both qualities. On a crisp autumn day, exactly 1 year after her arrival, Michael took Natalia to the Chicago Cultural Center. They stood beneath the magnificent Tiffany Dome where they had begun their first tour of the city. The colored light fell across her face, illuminating her profile against the backdrop of mosaics and marble. "I brought you here because this is where I first truly saw you," Michael said, taking her hands in his. "Not just your beauty, though that captivated me from the start, but your curiosity, your intelligence, your courage." He reached into his pocket and drew out a small box. Inside was not a ring, as she had momentarily expected, but a delicate silver pendant in the shape of an architectural detail, a small replica of a fragment from one of Louis Sullivan's famous ornamental designs. "This represents where we are now," he explained as he fastened it around her neck. "Building something beautiful together, piece by piece, with attention to every detail. I don't want to rush what we're creating, Natalia. Some structures need time to develop their true strength." She touched the pendant, understanding its symbolism, their relationship as an ongoing work of creation rather than a finished edifice or a predetermined plan. It suited them perfectly. "I love you, Michael," she said, the words emerging with the certainty of a long-considered architectural drawing finally brought to life. "Not for what you've done for me, but for who we become when we're together." "I love you too," he replied, his voice deep with emotion. "Every line and curve of you, inside and out." He traced the proud line of her nose with a gentle finger, and she didn't flinch or turn away as she once would have. Instead, she smiled, seeing herself reflected in his eyes, not as someone flawed or lacking, but as a woman whose distinctive beauty was part of her strength. 2 years later, Natalia's mother visited Chicago for their wedding. The ceremony was held in a restored historic building that Michael's firm had helped to preserve. A former library with soaring ceilings and natural light that poured through arched windows. The space represented everything they valued: history honored but not constrained by tradition, beauty that revealed itself to those who took time to look deeply, new purpose found in what others might have discarded. Natalia wore a modern gown with subtle embroidery inspired by Ukrainian folk patterns, designed by a friend she had met through the Cultural Society. Michael's eyes filled with tears when he saw her walking toward him, her steps confident, her gaze steady with certainty. Their vows included promises that went beyond the traditional: to see each other truly, to build a shared life with both flexibility and endurance, to recognize beauty in unexpected places. James had sent a card when he received their invitation, declining to attend but wishing them well. "I'm glad you found happiness in Chicago, even if not as we originally planned," he wrote. The words were polite, proper, just like him. Natalia felt no resentment as she read them, only a distant recognition of how narrowly she had defined her possibilities before fate intervened. As they shared their first dance as husband and wife, Michael whispered in her ear, "Do you remember what you told me about arranged marriages in the old days? How love could grow from respect and shared goals?" She nodded, remembering her conversation with Olena before leaving Ukraine, the pragmatic justification she had given for her decision to become a mail-order bride. "You were right," he continued, "but we got to arrange it ourselves, finding each other by chance and choice." Natalia looked around the room at their gathered friends, her colleagues from the architectural firm where she now worked as an office manager, Michael's wide circle of creative friends, members of the Ukrainian community who had welcomed her, neighbors who had become extended family. She thought of her journey, the hopes she had packed alongside her clothes, the disappointment that had nearly sent her home, the unexpected turn that had led her here. Her hand rose not to hide her nose, but to touch the architectural pendant that had become her everyday talisman. The pendant that now had a companion, a wedding band designed by Michael, featuring the same Sullivan-inspired pattern, symbolizing the continuation of their shared story. "Not chance," she corrected him with a smile, "destiny, but improved by our choices." Later that evening, as the celebration continued around them, Natalia stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. The Chicago skyline glittered against the night, each building a testament to human imagination and persistence. She thought about architecture as frozen music, as Michael had once described it, and recognized that her life had developed its own harmonies. complex, occasionally dissonant, but ultimately resolving into something both sturdy and beautiful. She had come to America seeking security through someone else's vision of her worth. She had found instead the freedom to define that worth for herself, to build a life not from borrowed blueprints, but from her own design, embracing every distinctive feature that made her uniquely, unmistakably Natalia. When Michael joined her on the terrace, wrapping his jacket around her shoulders against the evening chill, she leaned into him with the comfort of truly belonging. Not to him, but with him, two complete structures standing stronger together. "Ready to go back inside?" he asked after a moment. "Yes," she said, turning toward the light and music of their celebration. "I am ready." And she was, for this night, for their future, and for whatever redesigns life might require along the way. She had crossed an ocean seeking someone who would accept her. She had found someone who celebrated her instead. But most importantly, she had discovered how to do that for herself.